The early morning air was cool and crisp as Grace Walters adjusted the strap of her worn leather bag. Stepping off the bus onto the bustling streets of Shelbyville, the city greeted her with the rhythmic hum of life, cars honking, vendors shouting out their morning specials, and the distant clang of construction. It was a stark contrast to the slow, predictable pace of Lakewood, the small farming town where she had spent all 18 years of her life. Grace inhaled deeply, the mixture of exhaust fumes and the aroma of freshly baked bread filling her senses. This was it, a chance to create something for herself. A future far removed from the rows of cornfields and whispers of small-town gossip. She carried with her little more than determination and a few dollars saved from years of part-time jobs. Grace's first few weeks in Shelbyville were challenging. She had rented a small room in a shared boarding house on the quieter edge of the city. A modest place with creaky floors and peeling wallpaper. The other tenants were friendly but kept to themselves, which suited Grace just fine. Her days were spent job hunting, walking the streets in search of opportunities. Luck finally found her when she walked into an administrative office looking for a receptionist position. The hiring manager, Mrs. Wilkins, was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s with a keen eye for potential. After a brief interview, Grace was offered the job. "You seem reliable," Mrs. Wilkins said, adjusting her glasses. "Don't make me regret it." Grace nodded earnestly. "I won't, ma'am. I promise." The work was tedious but steady. And for the first time, Grace began to feel a sense of stability. Her co-workers were mostly older women who admired her work ethic. And although she missed the warmth of Lakewood, Shelbyville began to feel a little less overwhelming. Ethan Walters was one of the few men in the office. A junior manager with a quick wit and an easy smile. He had a way of making people feel at ease, even during the busiest days. Grace first noticed him during a particularly chaotic afternoon when the office copier broke down, leading to a cascade of frustrated employees. "Looks like the copier's at war with us again," Ethan quipped as he knelt to inspect the stubborn machine. Grace, holding a stack of papers, laughed nervously. "Does it ever work?" "Rarely," he replied with a grin. "But hey, it keeps things interesting." From that day, their interactions grew more frequent. Ethan would linger at her desk, cracking jokes or sharing stories about his love for photography and weekend hikes. Grace found herself smiling more whenever he was around. His charm and kindness a refreshing change from the routine of her days. Their friendship blossomed into something deeper during an office outing to the Shelbyville Botanical Gardens. Under the canopy of blooming cherry blossoms, Ethan finally gathered the courage to ask Grace out. "Would you like to grab dinner sometime? Just the two of us?" he asked. His voice casual but his eyes hopeful. Grace hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding. "I'd like that," she replied with a shy smile. Their first date was at a cozy Italian restaurant tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. Over plates of pasta and glasses of wine, they shared stories about their lives, Ethan's upbringing as the youngest of 3 brothers, Grace's memories of running through Lakewood's fields, and their dreams for the future. By the time the check arrived, it was clear to both of them that this was the beginning of something special. 2 years later, on a crisp autumn evening, Ethan took Grace to the very park where they had first shared their hopes and fears. Strings of fairy lights hung from the trees, casting a warm glow over the scene. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. Kneeling on one knee, he held it out to Grace. "Grace," he began, his voice steady but his hands trembling slightly. "You've made every day better since I met you. Will you marry me?" Tears welled in Grace's eyes as she nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes, Ethan, 1,000 times, yes." The park erupted in cheers as a few passers-by clapped and congratulated the couple. Grace and Ethan stood hand in hand, their future shining brightly ahead of them. Their wedding was a small, intimate affair held at a quaint chapel just outside of Shelbyville. Grace's parents made the trip from Lakewood, their pride evident as they watched their daughter walk down the aisle in a simple lace gown. Ethan's brothers served as his groomsmen, their playful banter filling the room with laughter. The reception was held in a local community hall, where friends and family danced late into the night. As Grace looked around the room, surrounded by people she loved, She felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Life was unfolding exactly as she had hoped. Grace and Ethan moved into a cozy apartment in the heart of Shelbyville. Though it wasn't much, it was theirs. They spent weekends decorating the space, turning it into a home filled with warmth and love. In those early days, everything felt perfect. Grace had found not only a partner but a life she could call her own. Little did she know, the seeds of future challenges were already being sown, waiting for the right moment to surface. The chapter ended with Grace sitting on their apartment balcony, a cup of tea in hand, watching the sun set over Shelbyville. She leaned against Ethan, who wrapped an arm around her shoulders. For now, the world was still, and Grace allowed herself to bask in the happiness of the moment. Life in Shelbyville seemed like a dream come true for Grace and Ethan as they settled into their roles as husband and wife. Their apartment was modest but filled with personal touches, photos from their trips, cozy throw blankets Grace crocheted, and Ethan's collection of vintage cameras proudly displayed on the bookshelf. The days were busy but fulfilling, with Grace balancing her office work and Ethan advancing in his managerial role. They laughed often and leaned on each other during life's small inconveniences. From broken faucets to forgotten anniversaries. 2 years into their marriage, they decided it was time to expand their family. The news of Grace's pregnancy was met with joy, tears, and nervous anticipation. The months that followed were filled with preparations, painting the nursery a soft yellow, attending prenatal classes, and shopping for tiny clothes. When their daughter, Emma, arrived on a warm summer evening, Grace felt a kind of love she hadn't known existed. As Ethan cradled the tiny bundle in his arms, his eyes glistening with tears, Grace whispered, "She's perfect." The early days of parenthood were a whirlwind of sleepless nights, diaper changes, and endless bottles. Grace often felt overwhelmed but took comfort in Ethan's presence. He was an attentive father, always ready to take over when she needed a moment to herself. Together, they navigated the challenges, finding joy in Emma's first smile, her tentative steps, and her infectious giggles. As Emma grew, the demands of life began to take their toll. Grace returned to work part-time when Emma was 6 months old, juggling her job and motherhood with the same determination that had brought her to Shelbyville years ago. Ethan, meanwhile, started taking on more responsibilities at his job, often working late or attending after-hours events. Grace noticed subtle changes in their relationship. The once light-hearted conversations over dinner became shorter, often dominated by discussions about bills, schedules, and work stress. Ethan seemed distracted, his phone buzzing constantly with messages and emails. One evening, as Grace was feeding Emma, Ethan came home visibly irritated. When she asked about his day, he brushed her off, muttering something about work drama. Grace let it slide, chalking it up to a rough day. But a nagging feeling began to grow in the back of her mind. Around this time, Ethan's younger sister, Melissa, began visiting more frequently. Melissa was bubbly and full of energy, always eager to help with Emma or lend a hand around the house. Grace appreciated her support, especially on days when she felt like she was barely keeping her head above water. "Melissa's such a blessing," Grace told Ethan one evening. "I don't know how I'd manage without her." Ethan nodded absent-mindedly, not looking up from his phone. "She's great," he said simply. Melissa's presence became a regular part of their lives. She often stopped by unannounced, offering to babysit Emma or cook dinner. At first, Grace thought nothing of it. Melissa was family, and her kindness seemed genuine. But over time, she began to notice things, little moments that made her stomach twist in discomfort. One afternoon, Grace came home early from work to find Melissa and Ethan sitting unusually close on the couch, their heads bent together over Ethan's phone. They sprang apart when they saw her, both wearing expressions of surprise. "Grace," Melissa exclaimed, her voice too bright. "You're home early." "Yeah," Grace said slowly, setting down her bag. "What's going on?" "Nothing," Ethan said quickly, standing and stretching. "Melissa was just showing me a funny video." Grace forced a smile, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Other moments followed, Melissa lingering after dinner when Ethan offered to drive her home. Their shared inside jokes that Grace wasn't privy to. And the way Ethan's demeanor shifted when Melissa was around. Grace tried to push the thoughts aside, telling herself she was being paranoid. Melissa was family, and Ethan loved her. He wouldn't betray her trust. When Emma developed a high fever one night, Grace's focus shifted entirely to her daughter. She and Ethan rushed to the hospital, where Emma was diagnosed with a severe ear infection. The days that followed were a blur of medication schedules, doctor's appointments, and sleepless nights. Ethan's support during this time was minimal. He seemed distracted, often glued to his phone or stepping out to take calls. Grace felt a pang of frustration as she rocked Emma to sleep one evening, her exhaustion mingling with a growing sense of isolation. "Do you even care?" she snapped when Ethan walked into the nursery. "What kind of question is that?" Ethan shot back, his tone defensive. "Of course, I care. I'm just handling things in my own way." Grace didn't press the issue, too tired to argue, but the distance between them was becoming harder to ignore. One fateful afternoon, Grace was tidying up the living room when Ethan's phone buzzed on the coffee table. He had left it unlocked, and a message preview from Melissa caught her eye. Her heart dropped as she read the words, "Can't wait to see you tonight. Don't forget the excuse." Her hands trembled as she scrolled through their conversation. The messages painted a picture she didn't want to believe: plans to meet in secret, flirtatious remarks, and shared complaints about Grace's nagging. The room seemed to spin around her as the realization sank in. Melissa, the woman she had welcomed into her home and trusted with her family, was betraying her in the worst possible way. And Ethan, the man she had vowed to spend her life with, was complicit. That evening, Grace confronted Ethan, her voice shaking with anger and hurt as she laid the phone in front of him. "Care to explain this?" she demanded. Ethan's face turned pale as he read the messages. "Grace, I can." "Don't," she interrupted, her voice breaking. "Don't insult me by lying. How long has this been going on?" Ethan looked away, guilt written all over his face. "It was a mistake," he said quietly. "It didn't mean anything." Grace's heart shattered. "It didn't mean anything?" she repeated, her voice rising. "You destroyed our family for something that didn't mean anything?" Ethan tried to reach for her, but she stepped back. "Don't touch me," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I don't even know who you are anymore." Grace packed a bag and took Emma to stay with a friend that night. Needing space to process the betrayal, the foundation of her life had been ripped away, leaving her feeling adrift and broken. But even in her pain, Grace knew one thing: she couldn't let this define her. For Emma's sake, she had to be strong. The road ahead would be difficult, but Grace was determined to rebuild her life from the ashes of her marriage. Grace stayed with her friend, Claire, for a few nights, her mind a whirlwind of emotions: rage, heartbreak, and disbelief. Emma, blissfully unaware of the turmoil, clung to her mother, her tiny hands a reminder of what mattered most. Grace replayed Ethan's betrayal in her mind, each memory of his distant behavior now a glaring red flag. Claire, a close confidant since Grace had moved to Shelbyville, was a pillar of support. "You don't have to decide anything right now," Claire said gently as Grace sat on her couch, staring blankly at the wall. "Take time to process this." "But how'd I move on?" Grace whispered, tears pooling in her eyes. "He was my husband. Melissa was family. How could they do this to me?" "Because they're selfish," Claire said firmly, "and that's on them, not you. You deserve better." After a few days, Grace knew she couldn't avoid Ethan forever. She returned to their apartment to collect more of Emma's things, steeling herself for the confrontation. Ethan was waiting in the living room, his eyes shadowed with guilt. "Grace," he began, standing as she entered. "Save it," she snapped, holding up a hand. "I'm not here to talk. I'm here to get Emma's things." "Please," Ethan pleaded, his voice breaking. "It was a mistake. I wasn't thinking straight. I love you." "Grace." She froze, the audacity of his words stoking her anger. "You love me?" she repeated, her voice trembling with fury. "Is that what love looks like? Ethan? Sneaking around with my own sister-in-law? Betraying the mother of your child?" Ethan hung his head, unable to meet her gaze. "I don't know what I was thinking." He murmured. I've ruined everything. Yes, you have, Grace said coldly. But you don't get to play the victim here. You made your choices, Ethan. Now you have to live with them. As she packed Emma's belongings, Ethan tried to apologize again. But Grace cut him off. This isn't about you anymore, she said, her voice steady despite the pain in her chest. It's about Emma. I'll do whatever it takes to protect her from this mess you've created. Grace hadn't spoken to Melissa since discovering the affair. She debated whether it was even worth it. But the betrayal gnawed at her. Eventually, she decided she needed to confront Melissa, not for closure, but to reclaim her power. When she arrived at Melissa's house, the younger woman looked startled but quickly recovered, her expression shifting to defensiveness. Grace, Melissa said, folding her arms. I guess you're here to yell at me. Grace's lips curled into a bitter smile. Yell at you, Melissa? Yelling doesn't even begin to cover what I want to do. But I'm not here to waste my energy. I just have one question. Why? Melissa looked away, her bravado faltering. I don't know, she muttered. It just happened. That's not an answer, Grace snapped. You didn't trip and fall into an affair. Melissa, you made a choice, a selfish, cruel choice that hurt everyone around you. Melissa's eyes filled with tears. I didn't mean for it to go this far, she whispered. I don't know what I thought. Grace's anger burned hotter at the pathetic response. You thought you could get away with it, she said coldly. You thought I wouldn't find out. Well, congratulations, Melissa. You've destroyed not just my marriage but our family. I hope it was worth it. Without waiting for a response, Grace turned and walked away, feeling a strange mix of fury and relief. She had said her piece. Now it was up to Melissa to live with the consequences. Grace returned to Claire's house. Exhausted but resolute, she knew she couldn't stay in limbo forever. She needed to decide what was next for her and Emma. Claire sat beside her, offering a glass of tea. You've been so strong, Grace. But what do you want to do now? Grace stared into the cup, her reflection rippling in the tea's surface. I want a fresh start, she said finally. For me and for Emma. I can't stay in this toxic cycle with Ethan. It's over. And Melissa? Claire asked. Grace shook her head. She's out of my life. I can't trust her. And I won't let her poison Emma's childhood. My focus has to be on rebuilding, not looking back. With Claire's encouragement, Grace began researching divorce lawyers and considering her options for co-parenting with Ethan. It wouldn't be easy, but she knew it was the right choice. As the weeks turned into months, Grace began to reclaim her life. She filed for divorce and worked out a custody arrangement with Ethan. He expressed a desire to be involved in Emma's life. And while Grace was wary, she agreed for Emma's sake. She also started therapy, finding solace in the support of a professional who helped her navigate her pain and rebuild her confidence. Each session was a step toward healing, a reminder that she was more than Ethan's betrayal. The community around Grace rallied to support her. Neighbors, co-workers, and even acquaintances offered kind words and acts of service, reminding her that she wasn't alone. One neighbor, an older woman named Martha, became a particularly close friend, often stopping by to babysit Emma or share a meal. You're stronger than you know, Martha told her one evening. And you're setting an incredible example for your daughter. She'll grow up knowing what resilience looks like. Grace smiled through her tears. For the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope. Grace knew the journey wasn't over. There would be tough days ahead, moments of doubt and heartache. But she also knew she had the strength to face them. As she tucked Emma into bed one night, Grace kissed her forehead and whispered, "We're going to be okay. Baby girl, I promise." And for the first time, she truly believed it. Grace moved into a small, cozy apartment in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't much, but it was hers. The walls were painted a soft cream, and sunlight streamed through the large windows in the living room. Grace decorated the space with care, choosing cheerful colors and family photos to make it feel like home for Emma. Emma adjusted surprisingly well. At 2 years old, she was too young to fully grasp the changes, but she sensed the warmth and safety in their new home. Grace found joy in setting up Emma's room, filling it with her favorite stuffed animals and colorful wall decals. It wasn't just a new beginning physically, it was emotional. 2. Grace was learning to embrace her independence. Though the challenges of single parenting were daunting, Ethan insisted on being part of Emma's life. While Grace was reluctant, she recognized the importance of a father-daughter bond. They agreed on a visitation schedule, with Ethan taking Emma every other weekend. Grace kept interactions civil, though her trust in him was irreparably shattered. The first time Ethan came to pick Emma up, Grace felt a wave of anxiety. He arrived on time, his demeanor subdued. "Hi, Grace," he said softly, his eyes searching hers for any sign of forgiveness. "Hi," she replied curtly, helping Emma into her tiny coat. "She's ready." Ethan crouched to Emma's level, his face softening. "Hey, sweet pea, ready to have some fun with Daddy?" Emma giggled, nodding eagerly. Grace's chest tightened. She wanted Emma to be happy, but watching her leave with Ethan was harder than she'd expected. After the door closed, Grace sat in the empty apartment, her thoughts swirling. She reminded herself that this arrangement was for Emma's benefit, even if it hurt her. Returning to work was a welcome distraction. Grace had taken time off during the separation, but now she threw herself into her job at a local marketing firm. Her colleagues were supportive, offering encouragement without prying into her personal life. Her boss, Angela, recognized Grace's determination and entrusted her with a major project for a new client. It was a challenge, but Grace welcomed it. Late nights at her desk became a refuge, a place where she could focus her energy and rebuild her sense of accomplishment. "Your work has been outstanding," Angela said during a team meeting. "You're setting an example for all of us." Grace felt a flicker of pride. For the first time in a long time, she believed she could thrive on her own. Claire continued to be a steadfast source of support, often stopping by with home-cooked meals or offering to babysit Emma. Grace also grew closer to Martha, her kind-hearted neighbor. Martha, who had raised 3 children of her own, became a maternal figure in Grace's life. Sometimes, the hardest moments lead to the most beautiful transformations. Martha told Grace over tea one evening, "You're doing better than you think, my dear." Grace found comfort in their conversations. Slowly, she began to open up about her fears and hopes, realizing she didn't have to face everything alone. Grace's therapy sessions became a cornerstone of her healing journey. Her therapist, Dr. Jennings, helped her unpack the layers of betrayal and loss, guiding her toward a healthier perspective. "You're allowed to grieve the life you thought you'd have," Dr. Jennings said during one session, "but don't let it define your future." Through therapy, Grace learned to set boundaries with Ethan and Melissa. She refused to engage in unnecessary communication and kept their interactions strictly about Emma. It was liberating to reclaim control over her life. One afternoon, while taking Emma to the park, Grace met a kind, soft-spoken man named David. He was playing catch with his young nephew, his easy smile and gentle demeanor immediately putting her at ease. They struck up a conversation, finding common ground in their love for children and shared experiences of heartbreak. David had recently moved to the area after his own divorce and was rebuilding his life. Their connection was tentative but genuine, and Grace found herself looking forward to their occasional encounters at the park. She wasn't ready for a new relationship, but David's presence reminded her that not all connections had to end in pain. "When the time is right," she thought, "maybe I'll open my heart again." The small neighborhood community began to feel like an extended family. Neighbors organized potlucks, and Grace joined a local parenting group, where she met other single mothers navigating similar challenges. Through these interactions, Grace found strength in shared experiences. She discovered that her story, though painful, was not unique. There was a quiet solidarity among the women, a reminder that resilience was a collective effort. One evening, Grace and Emma baked cookies together, their tiny apartment filled with the warm, sweet aroma. Emma's laughter rang out as she smeared frosting on her cheeks, and Grace couldn't help but laugh too. For the first time in what felt like forever, Grace felt truly happy. It was a quiet moment, but it symbolized everything she was fighting for: a life of love, stability, and hope for her daughter. As Grace settled into her new life, remnants of the past continued to surface. Melissa, her ex-sister-in-law, began to reach out through indirect channels. A mutual friend mentioned that Melissa had expressed regret and wanted to meet with Grace to apologize. When Grace heard this, her stomach churned. Melissa's betrayal was a wound that still felt raw, and the idea of facing her stirred up a mix of anger and anxiety. However, after much thought and a long conversation with her therapist, Grace decided to agree to the meeting, not for Melissa's sake, but for her own closure. They met at a small cafe near Grace's apartment. Melissa looked nervous, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped her coffee cup. "Grace," she began, her voice shaking, "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I needed to tell you how sorry I am." Grace listened, her face unreadable. Melissa went on to explain how she had been struggling in her marriage, seeking validation in all the wrong places. "It doesn't excuse what I did," Melissa said, tears brimming in her eyes. "I destroyed your trust and your family." When Melissa finished, Grace took a deep breath. "I can't say I forgive you," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But I do hope you find a way to fix your own life. I've moved on, and I won't let what you and Ethan did define me anymore." The conversation ended on a bittersweet note. As Grace walked away, she felt lighter. Letting go of the anger was a step toward her own healing. Co-parenting with Ethan remained difficult. Although he kept up with visitation, his commitment wavered. There were days he canceled last minute or showed up late, leaving Emma disappointed. Grace found herself frequently stepping in to fill the gaps, ensuring Emma didn't feel the brunt of her father's inconsistency. One afternoon, Ethan forgot to pick Emma up from daycare. Grace had to leave work early to get her daughter. Her frustration boiling over, she confronted Ethan the next day. "If you're not going to be consistent, don't make promises you can't keep," she said, her tone sharp. Ethan looked sheepish. "I'll do better," he muttered, but Grace wasn't holding her breath. She resolved to shield Emma from further disappointment, stepping into the role of both mother and father when necessary. Despite the challenges at home, Grace's career flourished. Her hard work on the major marketing project caught the attention of the company's executives. During a team meeting, her boss Angela announced that Grace would be promoted to senior marketing strategist. The news was a beacon of hope. For the first time in years, Grace felt truly valued and recognized for her efforts. She celebrated the achievement with Emma, who clapped her tiny hands and exclaimed, "You're the best, Mommy." It wasn't just a professional win, it was a personal one. Grace realized that her independence and resilience were paving the way for a brighter future. As Emma grew, she began to hit new milestones that filled Grace with pride and joy. She started preschool and quickly became known as the cheerful, curious child who loved to share her snacks and ask endless questions. One evening, as Grace was tucking her into bed, Emma looked up at her with wide, innocent eyes. "Mommy, why don't I see Daddy as much as before?" The question caught Grace off guard. She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes, people make choices that make it hard for them to be around as much as they should. But remember, I'm always here for you. And I love you more than anything." Emma nodded, seeming satisfied with the answer. Grace hugged her tightly, silently vowing to always be honest and present for her daughter. Grace's casual encounters with David at the park turned into a genuine friendship. They began meeting more regularly, sharing stories of their pasts and discussing their hopes for the future. David, who worked as a graphic designer, often brought his sketches to the park, where Emma loved to watch him draw. "You're really talented," Grace remarked one afternoon, admiring a whimsical illustration of a treehouse. "Have you ever thought about illustrating children's books?" David smiled. "It's a dream of mine. Maybe someday." Their conversations were light-hearted but meaningful. Grace appreciated having someone who understood her struggles without judgment. While she wasn't ready for anything romantic, the bond they shared reminded her that meaningful connections were still possible. One day, Grace received an unexpected call from Ethan. His tone was serious. "I lost my job," he admitted. "I don't know how I'll keep up with child support." Grace felt a pang of frustration but also empathy. "Emma still needs stability," she said. "Figure something out. I can't carry all the weight." The conversation left Grace feeling unsettled. She confided in Claire later that evening. What if he keeps letting Emma down? She asked, her voice heavy with worry. Claire squeezed her hand. You've already shown Emma what it means to be strong and loving. She'll always have you, and that's what matters most. Despite the challenges, Grace found joy in the small victories. She and Emma planted a tiny garden on their balcony, growing cherry tomatoes and basil. They spent weekends exploring local libraries and baking together, creating memories that would last a lifetime. One evening, as they sat on the couch reading a story, Emma leaned her head against Grace's shoulder. I love you, Mommy, she whispered. Grace smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. I love you too, sweetheart, always. As Grace continued to rebuild her life, the community around her began to play an increasingly important role. Her neighborhood was a mix of families, retirees, and young professionals, and over time, Grace found herself forming meaningful relationships with her neighbors. One of her closest connections was with Mrs. Peterson, a kind-hearted woman in her 60s who lived 2 floors above. Mrs. Peterson had a knack for baking, and she often brought over fresh bread and cookies for Grace and Emma. You're doing an amazing job raising that little girl, she said one day, handing Grace a loaf of warm sourdough. If you ever need help, you know where to find me. The support extended beyond Mrs. Peterson. Parents at Emma's preschool organized playdates and potlucks, and Grace was grateful for the camaraderie. She realized she wasn't alone in her journey. There were others who cared and wanted to help. One Saturday morning, Grace attended a community meeting at the local park. The discussion centered on revitalizing the neighborhood, with a focus on creating safe spaces for children and families. David, who had become an active member of the community, was leading the effort. We're proposing to turn the empty lot by the library into a community garden, he explained, pointing to a map. It would be a place for families to gather, grow food, and learn about sustainability. The idea resonated deeply with Grace. She raised her hand. I'd love to help. I've been gardening with my daughter, and it's been such a positive experience for us. Count me in. Over the next few weeks, Grace threw herself into the project. She helped organize fundraisers, coordinate volunteers, and even get Emma involved in painting colorful signs for the garden. The work gave her a sense of purpose and reminded her of the power of community. Emma's preschool announced its annual spring play, and Emma was ecstatic to take part. She practiced her lines diligently, often reciting them to Grace while they cooked dinner or walked to the park. On the evening of the performance, Grace sat in the front row, beaming with pride as Emma delivered her lines with confidence. The little girl's joy was infectious, and Grace couldn't help but marvel at how far they had come since the tumultuous days of the divorce. After the play, Emma ran into her mother's arms. Did I do good, Mommy? She asked, her eyes shining. You were amazing, Grace replied, holding her close. I'm so proud of you. Despite his promises, Ethan continued to struggle with consistency. One weekend, he canceled a planned visit with Emma at the last minute, leaving the little girl in tears. Grace was furious but kept her emotions in check. She knelt down to Emma's level and hugged her tightly. I'm so sorry, sweetheart, she said. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes. How about we have a special day together instead? They spent the day visiting a children's museum, eating ice cream, and riding the carousel at the park. By the time they returned home, Emma's disappointment had faded, replaced by laughter and excitement. That evening, Grace sent Ethan a firm message. Emma deserves better. If you can't be there for her, don't make promises you can't keep. Ethan apologized but offered no concrete solution. Grace decided to focus on what she could control, being the best parent she could for Emma. As Grace's reputation at work grew, so did her opportunities. Angela, her manager, approached her with a proposition. Grace, we're launching a new initiative to expand our brand into international markets. I think you'd be perfect to lead the project. Grace was stunned. That's an incredible opportunity, she said, but it sounds like a big responsibility. Angela smiled. You've proven time and time again that you can handle challenges. I have no doubt you'll excel. After discussing the logistics and weighing the impact on her work-life balance, Grace accepted the role. The project was demanding, But it was also a chance to grow professionally and provide a better future for Emma. One evening, after putting Emma to bed, Grace found herself reflecting on the changes in their lives. She walked into Emma's room and sat beside her. The little girl looked up, sleepy but curious. "Emma," Grace began, stroking her daughter's hair, "do you know how much I love you? To the moon and back." Emma replied with a giggle. "That's right," Grace said, smiling. "You're the most important person in my life. And everything I do is for you." Emma reached out to hold her mother's hand. "I love you too, Mommy. You're my favorite." Grace felt tears welling up but held them back. "No matter what happens, we're a team, okay? Just you and me." Emma nodded, her eyes closing as she drifted off to sleep. Grace sat beside her for a while, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the life they were building together. As the months passed, Grace continued to thrive in her career, her community, and her role as a mother. The community garden became a vibrant space for families, a testament to the power of unity and determination. Emma grew more confident and happy, her laughter filling their home with light. Grace's journey wasn't without challenges, but she faced each one with resilience and grace. With the support of her community and the unbreakable bond she shared with Emma, she knew that the future held endless possibilities. As Grace continued to find balance in her life, she began to notice subtle changes in her interactions with people around her. Among those in her circle, David stood out. His efforts with the community garden had brought them closer, and their conversations often extended beyond the project. They talked about everything: childhood memories, career ambitions, and their shared desire to make a difference. One evening, after a long day of planting new seedlings in the garden, David invited Grace and Emma to join him for dinner at a nearby family-owned diner. The atmosphere was warm and inviting, with the smell of fresh pies wafting through the air. As they sat across from each other, Grace noticed how easily David connected with Emma. He listened attentively as she talked about her favorite animals and her dreams of becoming an astronaut. His kindness and patience touched Grace deeply. After dinner, as they walked home under the glow of streetlights, David turned to Grace. "You're an incredible person," he said, his tone sincere. "The way you've rebuilt your life and raised Emma, it's inspiring." Grace felt her cheeks warm. "Thank you, David. That means a lot coming from you. You've done so much for this community. I'm lucky to know you." They shared a moment of quiet understanding, the unspoken connection between them growing stronger. Despite her budding feelings for David, Grace was cautious. She had been hurt before, and her priority was Emma. She confided in Mrs. Peterson, who had become a trusted confidant. "It's okay to be careful," Mrs. Peterson said over tea one afternoon. "But don't let fear keep you from opening your heart again. David seems like a good man. He's proven that he cares about you and Emma." Grace nodded thoughtfully. She decided to take things slow, allowing herself the space to explore her feelings without rushing into anything. Emma's 5th birthday was fast approaching, and Grace wanted to make it special. She teamed up with her new friends in the community to plan a surprise party at the garden. David offered to help with decorations, and Mrs. Peterson baked a towering cake adorned with flowers and butterflies. On the day of the party, Emma's face lit up as she arrived at the garden to see it transformed into a magical wonderland. Balloons and streamers hung from the trees, and a table was piled high with gifts and treats. David brought out a small telescope, a gift he'd chosen for Emma after hearing about her fascination with space. "I thought this might help you explore the stars," he said, kneeling to her level. Emma's eyes widened with excitement. "Thank you, Mr. David. Can we use it tonight?" "Of course," he replied with a smile. As the evening wound down and the guests began to leave, Grace watched Emma and David peering through the telescope together. The sight filled her with a sense of contentment she hadn't felt in years. A few weeks after Emma's birthday, David asked Grace to join him for coffee. As they sat in the cozy cafe, he looked at her with a mix of hope and vulnerability. "Grace," he began, "I care about you, and I care about Emma. I know you've been through so much, and I don't want to rush or pressure you, but I want you to know that I'm here, for both of you, if you're ready to let someone in." Grace's heart raced. She appreciated his honesty and the respect he showed for her feelings. "David, she said softly. I've been so focused on rebuilding my life and being a good mother that I never thought about this, about us. But I see the way you are with Emma, and I see how much you care. I think I'd like to see where this could go. David's smile was warm and genuine. One step at a time. He said, we'll figure it out together. As Grace and David began to explore their relationship, they kept things simple and grounded. They spent time together as a family, going to the park, visiting museums, and sharing meals. David's patience and steady presence reassured Grace that she had made the right decision. Emma adored David, often asking when he would visit next. Mr. David is fun, Mommy, she said one evening as Grace tucked her into bed. He makes me laugh, and he's really good at hide and seek. Grace smiled, her heart full. I'm glad you like him. Sweetheart, he thinks you're pretty amazing too. One evening, as Grace and David sat on her balcony watching the sunset, she opened up about her fears and the journey that had brought her to this point. I was so broken after everything with Ethan, she admitted. I didn't think I could trust anyone again. David took her hand gently. You're stronger than you realize. Grace, you've built a beautiful life for yourself and Emma, and I'm grateful to be a part of it. Grace squeezed his hand, her heart swelling with gratitude. She knew there would still be challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful about the future. Life was beginning to take on a new rhythm for Grace. Her relationship with David was blossoming, and Emma was thriving. But one day, a knock on her door brought an unwelcome reminder of the past. Standing on her doorstep was Ethan, his once confident demeanor replaced with something more subdued. Grace, he began, his voice hesitant. I know I don't deserve to be here, but I needed to see you and Emma. Grace felt her chest tighten. It had been years since she'd seen Ethan, and the sight of him stirred a mix of emotions, anger, hurt, and a faint curiosity about what had brought him back. What do you want, Ethan? She asked, her tone guarded. He glanced down, as if searching for the right words. I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I realized how much I've messed up. I wanted to apologize, to both of you, for everything. Grace crossed her arms, her posture stiff. An apology? After all these years? What brought this on? Ethan looked up, his eyes meeting hers. I've been through counseling, trying to fix my life. And one thing they told me was to face my mistakes and try to make amends. Grace hesitated, unsure of what to say. She didn't want Ethan to disrupt the peace she had worked so hard to rebuild. But she also knew Emma deserved the chance to decide for herself. Emma's at school, Grace finally said. If you really want to apologize to her, you'll have to do it right. No empty promises, no excuses. Ethan nodded, his expression serious. I understand. Thank you for giving me the chance. That evening, Grace sat Emma down to explain Ethan's visit. She chose her words carefully, wanting to give Emma the facts without pushing her in any direction. Your father stopped by today, Grace began. He says he wants to see you and apologize for the time he's missed. How do you feel about that? Emma tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. I don't really remember him much, Mommy, but, if he's sorry, I guess I can talk to him. Grace smiled softly, proud of her daughter's maturity. Okay, sweetheart, we'll take it slow. If you ever feel uncomfortable, just let me know. A week later, Grace arranged a meeting at a neutral location, a quiet park where Emma felt safe. Ethan arrived early, nervously pacing near a bench. When Emma saw him, she hesitated for a moment before walking over. Hi, she said shyly. Hi, Emma, Ethan replied, his voice thick with emotion. You've grown so much. You're beautiful, just like your mom. Emma glanced at Grace, who gave her a reassuring nod. Thanks, Emma said softly. Mom says you wanted to say sorry. Ethan knelt to Emma's level, his voice breaking slightly. I do. I made a lot of mistakes. And I hurt you and your mom. I wasn't there for you when I should have been. And I'll regret that for the rest of my life. I'm so sorry, Emma. Emma studied him for a moment, her young mind processing his words. You can't change what happened, she said, her tone surprisingly firm. But if you really mean it, I guess I can forgive you. Tears welled in Ethan's eyes as he nodded. Thank you, Emma. That means more to me than you'll ever know. Grace watched from a distance. Her emotions a whirlwind. This moment wasn't about her. It was about Emma finding her own sense of closure. After the meeting, Ethan expressed his desire to be more involved in Emma's life. Grace agreed, but she set firm boundaries. You'll need to earn her trust. Ethan, she said, this isn't about you making yourself feel better. It's about being there for Emma in the way you should have been from the start. Ethan nodded, his face solemn. I understand, Grace. I won't let her down again. True to his word, Ethan began taking small steps to rebuild his relationship with Emma. He attended her school events, wrote her letters, and showed up when he said he would. Grace remained cautious but allowed herself to acknowledge his efforts. Throughout it all, David stood by Grace's side. He listened without judgment and offered advice when she asked for it. How do you feel about Ethan being back in the picture? David asked one evening as they sat together on the couch. Grace sighed, resting her head on his shoulder. It's complicated. Part of me is still angry at him for everything he put us through. But another part of me wants Emma to have the chance to know her father. As long as he doesn't hurt her again. David wrapped an arm around her. You're doing the right thing, Grace. You're giving Emma a choice. And that's what matters. As months passed, Grace found herself balancing her past and present. Ethan remained in Emma's life. But his role was secondary to the family Grace had built with David. Together, they created a life filled with love, trust, and hope for the future. One evening, as the three of them sat in the garden watching the stars, Emma turned to Grace and David. I think this is my favorite place, she said, her voice filled with contentment. Grace smiled, her heart full. Mine too, sweetheart, mine too. The journey had been long and filled with challenges. But Grace knew she had found her way. And with David and Emma by her side, she was ready for whatever the future held.